Huge breaking news on Wednesday for the U.S. men's national team. U.S. Soccer has relieved men's national team head coach Greg Berhalter of his duties effective immediately. The decision comes after the USMNT crashed out of Copa America in the group stage, marking the first time in 20 international tournaments on home soil that the U.S. failed to advance past the group stage. Berhalter's second tenure in charge lasted just 14 matches. In a statement, U.S. Soccer said that it has already begun a search for a replacement. So Greg Berhalter out as head coach of the national team. The U.S. won 44 of 74 games in Berhalter's 2 stints in charge and largely enjoyed success against CONCACAF competition, winning the 2021 and 2024 Nations Leagues and the 2021 Gold Cup. The Americans dominated CONCACAF but struggled against top competition from the rest of the world, winning just 10 of 27 matches against non-CONCACAF teams and 5 of 20 matches against teams in the top 20 in the FIFA rankings, with most of those coming against Mexico. Those struggles continued in Berhalter's final month in charge, with losses to Colombia and Uruguay surrounding a shocking loss to Panama that ultimately led to their surprise group stage exit from Copa America. Here is the statement from the U.S. Soccer president, Cindy Parlow-Cone. "We are now focused on working with our sporting director, Matt Crocker, and leveraging his experience at the highest levels of the sport to ensure we find the right person to lead the USMNT into a new era of on-field success." We're joined now by the U.S. Soccer legend, Tony Meola. Now, Tony, you've been talking about this story for a long time. Will they, won't they? In the end, they make the decision. What was your reaction when you found out that in the end he's gone as head coach of the national team?
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Unfortunately for Greg, it didn't work out in this second term, and I think we kind of felt this building to this moment. We just didn't know when it was going to be. We're all sort of anticipating. They said middle of next week, anticipating this. And I guess we'll look back on Greg Berhalter in sort of 2 sections, phase number 1 and then phase number 2 when he came back the second time. And this part hasn't gotten better. And I know there was a lot of pressure from fans. Both supporters groups put statements out. I still think in the end the decision was ultimately made on the fact that we needed to see progress. And that's what I've been harping on from December of 2022 when we got knocked out of the World Cup until now. And I don't know that we saw that progress.
So why was it so difficult for the team to progress? Was it something tactically he did? Was it a lack of buy-in from the players? Or was it a combination of a couple different things?
Well, I think it's a combination of a few things, but you look at this particular group. Think about this group, first of all. They really haven't known anything other than Greg Berhalter's way, right? Because this is, let's call it the new generation, right? We didn't qualify for a World Cup in 2018, and all of a sudden now we've got to rebuild this thing. And Greg did a good job of getting us back to the World Cup and getting out of that group. And I still think they got in 2022 as far as they could possibly go, because I still don't think we were better than the Netherlands, right? And I don't know that we would have had, of our 11 players, one guy that would have went there. But it was a young team, and is what they needed. And in a lot of ways, as we know, anyone who's raised a kid knows sometimes you got to coddle those kids. Sometimes you got to kick them in the backside. Yeah. I just don't know that now in this second cycle, I felt like, and I don't know, and I've seen this before, but I felt there was this tilt towards it was the players' team. And in the end, I'm old school, right? The teams are the coaches' teams, right? Coaches tell you, what you do, how you do it, and you go out and you try and do it. And I felt like we were always trying to appease the players. And we heard about this, they all loved each other. Look, I played on a lot of national teams, and I hate going back, you guys know, to my career, but I don't remember a team that didn't like each other. Well, we didn't talk about it all the time. We talked about one thing. We talked about getting results because you're trying to be the best team you can be. I just think in a lot of ways, I don't like the term lost the dressing room, because I do think they like Greg. I just think he lost a way to continue to teach them in order to get better.
Almost lost that sense of authority rather than that sense of respect. Now, you look at what's to come here. We're not far away from the next World Cup. You don't have a tournament like Copa America to get the side ready. You look at the history of the U.S. men's national team. The last time a manager won't have had the full 4 years, or at least longer than 2 years, was Bob Ganser ahead of 1990 when he took over. In terms of having that limited window and that lack of opportunity against big-level opposition, how much can a new manager really affect change before the next World Cup?
Well, I certainly think they can. I know there's not a lot of big matches, but how many times do we see managers come like a month before a World Cup and all of a sudden their team performs because something happened, right? And if you're going to
we saw at AFCON within the tournament.
Within the tournament, yeah. So when you think about it that way, I don't know that the time is that. I think more importantly, the fact that we don't have major competition. Remember, Jurgen Klinsmann, Bob Bradley, Bruce Arena, they had a massive advantage over Greg Berhalter and whoever takes over. They had the chance to schedule just about anybody for friendlies. And they went and got the biggest friendlies they could. But with Nations League, we don't have that. And I know we've talked about this ad nauseum, right? That we can't get these games and we're stuck with some teams that maybe won't get us to the next step. So that guy's going to have to be really good in galvanizing this group, getting his message out as quickly as possible and as clearly as possible so they understand. I think in the end, what I lost sight of and what I was probably most discouraged with, I couldn't tell you what type of team we were. I couldn't tell you if we were a counterattacking team. I couldn't tell you if we were a possession team. I couldn't tell you if we were an over-the-top team. And I know you want to be a little bit of all of those when you play, but that's what I personally lost sight of. And that's where I was like, okay, you've got to get this right. And we were told Copa America is so important to this progression to 2026, and it didn't work out. I do want to rewind, if you don't mind, really, really quick, because just talking about Greg Berhalter, look, I've seen the comments, right? Greg Berhalter is a teammate of mine. We shouldn't make Greg Berhalter a villain. This is a guy who played for our national team, played in the World Cup, and I'm sure spent endless hours trying to make this national team better. It didn't work out, but for me, he's still a hero in U.S. soccer sort of lore, if you will, because he was one of our national team players at the World Cup. Unfortunately, didn't work out, and now we'll try and move on and get better. I do think we have the players to do it, but we got to find the right guy. And I'm not enamored by a name.
Yeah.
I want the right guy, because no one knew De La Fuente at Spain, right? No one knew him until like the last 2 weeks.
That hiring was received poorly.
Right? No one knew Lionel Scaloni before. I mean, if you didn't play against him, like I was fortunate enough to do, you didn't know who he was, right? But he goes on and wins the World Cup. So for me, I'm not enamored. If it's a name, that's okay. I'm okay with that. But I want the right guy.
So who's the right guy in your eyes?
Yeah.
Again, somebody that can control this locker room right from start. Look, again, they're not going to have a ton of time. They don't have a ton of friendly windows to play. And I guess we'll have one Nations League, right? One more Nations League coming up next year, right? I haven't looked that far out in the schedule. But someone who will demand respect from the group. And again, I think because of the lack of top-notch quality opponents where you can make adjustments and learn a lot about your team, whatever the message is for me needs to be really clear. And it needs to be clear really quick.
And for more on this news of Greg Berhalter departing as U.S. men's national team head coach, we bring in Mike Grella, who played for Greg Berhalter at Columbus Crew. Grella, we've been reacting to this for some time. When Greg Berhalter is ultimately let go here, what ultimately do you think is the legacy? Because we heard Tony saying there that it's not all bad. It wasn't all bad for him in charge, but where ultimately do you think that things went well for him and things ultimately let him down and he pays with his job?
I've got to echo what Tony says a little bit. I mean, again, I'm looking and listening to some of the comments and reading some of the comments, and people are like, well, it ended before it started. He's not a good enough manager, didn't deserve the job. I can't disagree more with any of this. I mean, this is a guy, I'm going to say this again, I worked with him on a daily basis. This is a guy who you could have a conversation with about the game, about football, about life, cared about your family, knew everyone's name. He's a guy that's in the building that makes any group he enters into better. Never stops thinking about the game, how to make it better. I mean, he is hands down one of the top managers in this country and one of the top managers around in the game. Now, I do echo what Tony says. When you watch the national team play, when you watch other national teams play, right? Let's look at the more successful ones. Like tonight, we're going to see Colombia or Uruguay. When we watch Italy play, when we watch Brazil play, when we watch Argentina play, we all know what we're going to get to a certain extent. That manager leaves a stamp on them of identity, of are they going to play in transition? I mean, we watched Netherlands today, right? The 4-3-3, very good in transition. We know more or less what the identity of the team is. When you watch this team, I don't think you knew that. And Greg was brought in to play an attacking brand of football, a fluid brand of football, and that was never evident. I don't think we really hurt teams with that type of football. Now, whether we don't have the personnel, whether he didn't have enough time with that group, I'm not so sure. But I think everyone would agree in the end that it was probably time, with no disrespect to Greg and the job that he's done, probably time to move on.
How important is it for the next manager to have an authority over some of the player personnel that comes in and make decisions based on form in club situations versus just name situations?
That's huge. And again, I'm going to echo Tony on that too. Listen, if you want to call it old school, I'm not sure that's what it is, but the manager is the manager, and he has the final say on most of these things. Who's coming in, who's performing, what the type of guys that he wants. I mean, in certain countries and certain national teams, there's wild cards that are brought, and there's big names that are left home. I mean, this happens all the time, and it's down to the manager and his plan and what he sees for the future of the team. And I think it has become, for a long time now, a little bit taken for granted that you're going to get the call up. It's more or less the same guys that are going to get the call up, right? And it's because, oh, well, they play in these big clubs, and because they've had a decent couple games, or because they've been part of the pool, or they've been part of the project. I'll never go away from this belief in the game, is that you have to earn it. You're only as good as your last game. And if you're not performing, you shouldn't be called. And if you are performing, you should be called, regardless of your pedigree and your name and all these other things that I think is very easy to get blurred vision about. If you're performing and you're working, and every time you put that badge on, you're giving everything you have, and you're a quality player, you should be in the team. And if you're not doing those things, you shouldn't be out of the team. And I think we lost that a little bit. We lost that a little bit, where guys were getting called in for granted.
You know, Mike brings up a good point. Mike, you and I had this discussion. What if the next manager comes in and the first thing he says is, you need to be playing week in and week out at your club team? Now, think about the roster we just put together and how different, Mike, that roster might look.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it is, right? I mean, you could have had a great season 2 years ago or a year ago, but you've only played 10 games coming into it. I mean, Tyler Adams was a roommate of mine, someone I spent a couple of years with at New York Red Bull. I'm a massive fan of Tyler, but he hadn't played forever. He's been injured for a long time. He hadn't had a season under his belt for a long time. And, you know, it's straight back away into the team. And now he's probably not a good example, because he's one of the top players that we have, I think. But you have to be playing. You need form. I mean, there was a conversation with the goalkeepers, who should be playing as a goalkeeper. And at one point, we had nobody playing first-team football. And you can't go into these matches, into a Copa America, and I mean, make these kind of mistakes, because the margins are so small. When you're playing against Uruguay and you're playing against Panama, where you need to get 3 points, the margins are very small. You see what happens here is Weah gets the red card. That totally affects the outcome of the game, and that totally affects the way that the U.S. men's national team had to play against Uruguay. And those are the mistakes that, when you want to call it down to lack of leadership, lack of maturity, is it down to the manager? I'm not sure. But those are the mistakes that we were making far too often.